The sound of my son's voice cut through the air like a knife, his words piercing deeper than I'd ever imagined. "Your human waste. Rot here." Still, I didn't flinch. My hands, steady as stone, reached for the bag by the door. As I packed, the faint smell of old leather filled the room, reminding me of what I'd built, what was still mine. While the silence settled, I realized one thing. He had already given up everything. That's when I grabbed the deed and walked out without looking back. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you watching from? I hope your day's gentle and calm. Please like, subscribe, and let's start our story together. The air was crisp with the promise of fall as Henry Caldwell stepped out of his car and looked up at his son's modern home. The house was sleek, with sharp angles and large windows, bathed in the soft glow of evening light. He had spent weeks preparing for this dinner, trying to put aside the growing tension between him and Brian. A handmade gift sat in the passenger seat, a simple wooden frame he had crafted himself, and a photo album, old and fraying, filled with memories of Brian as a child, his first steps, his first bike ride, the day he graduated. All these things Henry had never imagined would be forgotten. Yet there he was, walking to the door with that same feeling of hope he had clung to for too long. As he rang the doorbell, Henry couldn't help but feel the weight of his decision to come. He had hoped the dinner would be different. After all, it was Brian's birthday, a moment of reconnection. But something told him that tonight would be another reminder that things had changed forever. The door swung open, and there stood Brian, tall and confident, dressed in a sharp shirt that looked far too polished for the occasion. His smile was thin, forced, but Henry returned it with his own quiet one, trying to mask the unease settling deep in his stomach. "Dad, thanks for coming," Brian said, his tone flat, almost dismissive as he stepped aside to let him in. Henry stepped inside, and the difference was immediately apparent. The house was filled with laughter, but none of it was from familiar voices. The crowd was made up entirely of Kara's friends, people Henry didn't know, didn't care to know. He had half expected this. It was Kara's night too, after all, but the absence of his own family, his own connections, stung more than he anticipated. He stood there for a moment, the hum of chatter echoing in his ears, before he was led further inside. Kara appeared from across the room, her smile as bright and practiced as ever. She was surrounded by a group of women, laughing loudly, tossing back wine. When she noticed Henry, her smile faltered for just a moment before she recovered, stepping forward to greet him. "Henry, I'm so glad you could make it," she said, her voice too sweet, too polite, and yet somehow empty. "We're so excited to see Brian start a new chapter in his life." Before Henry could respond, she raised her glass and, as if on cue, turned to the room. "Brian deserves new beginnings, without the old baggage," she announced loudly, the words cutting through the room like a knife. The guests tittered awkwardly, but Henry remained silent, the sting of the comment sinking deep into his chest. He tried to hide the hurt, but it was there, like a bitter taste he couldn't wash away. The words hung in the air, the implication clear. Henry was the baggage, the burden to be discarded. Brian stood by, his hands in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the floor. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence spoke volumes. Henry forced a smile, nodding slightly as the conversation shifted. He clutched the small box in his hand, the wooden frame inside, the gift he had worked so hard on. He had wanted to give Brian something meaningful, something that might remind him of the past they shared. But now, it felt like nothing more than a token of an old man who didn't know his place anymore. Dinner started, and the guests continued to chat, filling the air with shallow pleasantries. Henry was offered a seat beside Brian, and though the space between them felt like a canyon, he sat, determined to at least make the best of it. The food was good, but the tension was thicker than the wine in their glasses. Brian barely looked at him, his focus on his plate, his mind seemingly elsewhere. Finally, the clinking of glasses cut through the low hum of conversation, and Kara stood, raising her glass in a toast. Henry didn't want to look up, didn't want to be a part of this moment that already felt so fractured, but he did. He met Brian's eyes for the first time all evening, and his son raised his glass. To family who build you up, Brian began, his voice loud, clear, and cold. Not drag you down. He held the toast for a beat longer than necessary, and then, in a move so pointed that it cut through the last threads of any illusion of civility, Brian's gaze shifted to Henry. You're human waste, Brian continued, the words laced with disdain, each syllable heavy with a cruelty that hung in the air. Rot here! The room fell silent. The laughter that had filled the air moments ago died instantly. Henry felt the words like a slap across his face, each one more forceful than the last. The guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, not knowing how to react, unsure if they had just witnessed something they shouldn't have. Henry's hands tightened around his glass, the tension in his chest threatening to overwhelm him. But he didn't speak. He didn't react. He simply set his glass down on the table with deliberate calm, the sound of it settling against the wood, a quiet but powerful declaration. The table was silent. The weight of the words, the betrayal, hung between them like a shadow. And for a long moment, Henry sat there, the sting of Brian's words settling in his bones. He had never expected to hear such venom from his son. He had never imagined that this moment, the one he had hoped would be a reconnection, would be the one where everything broke. But there was nothing more to say. Henry knew what had to be done. He had already made the decision. The betrayal was too much. The break was final. And so he sat, still, staring at the table, letting the silence stretch on. As the awkward laughter returned to the room, Henry's mind already turned to the next step. The road ahead was clear, and he wasn't about to let anyone, least of all his son, think that he was something to be discarded. The laughter continued, but it was no longer his concern. Henry stepped through the back door, the cold November air biting at his skin as it wrapped around him like a shroud. The briskness of it cut through his jacket, a reminder that fall was slowly turning into winter, the days getting shorter, the nights colder. But it wasn't the chill in the air that made him shiver. It was the words Brian had just thrown at him, the sting of that unearned, brutal cruelty. He didn't look back at the house. He didn't want to see the laughing faces through the windows. He didn't want to hear Kara's voice, too loud, too dismissive, as she basked in her husband's success, oblivious to the damage she had caused. Henry stepped further out into the yard, his boots crunching on the first frost, the grass brittle underfoot. His hands found their way into his pockets, his fingers curling into fists, trying to shake off the feeling of rejection, of being cast aside. As he walked, memories started to flood in, each one pulling him back to a different time, simpler times. He saw himself, years ago, kneeling beside Brian's bike, grease under his nails, tightening bolts, while Brian complained about the training wheels. He remembered paying for Brian's college tuition, those late nights working overtime to make sure his son got the best education. How proud he had been, watching him walk across that stage. And then there was the house, the one Brian now lived in, the one Henry had built with his own hands. Every beam, every nail had been a promise to his family, a promise that their lives would be secure, that the house would be a sanctuary for them all. But now, it felt like all of it had been forgotten, swept away by Brian's arrogance and Kara's manipulation. Henry stopped for a moment, his breath visible in the cold air. He could still hear Kara's laugh echoing through the open door. It rang in his ears like a mocking tune. He could almost feel her eyes on him, judging him as if he were the one who had failed. It stung more than he wanted to admit. He whispered softly to the wind, the words of promise to himself. You can have your house, just not mine. His voice barely rose above the sound of the breeze, but in that moment, it felt like the final act of surrender. He wasn't going to fight for that house anymore. He was done with it. He wouldn't let Brian or Kara think they could take what he had worked so hard for, what he had built from nothing. But it was more than just the house. It was his dignity, his place in this family, and they had both stripped that away with one cruel sentence. Henry turned and walked back toward his car. His footsteps were slow, deliberate, as if he was already planning the next move, already deciding that this would be the moment everything changed. He wasn't going to beg for respect. He wasn't going to grovel for a place in his own son's life. He had nothing left to give to a son who saw him as nothing but human waste. The drive home was long, quiet. The headlights from passing cars reflected on the windshield like ghosts, stretching and distorting, almost mocking him. Henry's hands gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white against the leather. He couldn't stop thinking about Brian's face, cold, indifferent. But it wasn't just Brian that haunted him. It was the way he had looked at the life they once had, the way he had dismissed it all in one harsh sentence. Henry couldn't remember the last time he had felt this alone. And yet, as the city lights blurred past him, he felt something else, a kind of clarity. The feeling was growing, swelling in him like a wave. He wasn't finished. He wouldn't be discarded. He wasn't going to let Brian win. Not this time. He pulled into his driveway and cut the engine, the silence in the car settling around him. The house loomed before him. His house. The house he had built. The home he had made with his late wife. The place where he had raised his family. The door creaked as he stepped out, the cold biting into his face as he made his way inside. His eyes were drawn to the old family deed, still framed on the wall by the door, a reminder of everything he had fought for, everything he had built from the ground up. It was still there, still under his name, a legacy waiting to be taken back. Rob smiled faintly, the corners of his lips lifting ever so slightly. He didn't know how yet, but he knew one thing. It was time for the scales to tip. Brian had crossed the line, but Henry wasn't about to let his son tear everything down. Not the house, not the legacy, and certainly not his dignity. The decision was forming. Quietly, almost imperceptibly, but it was there. Henry's hand lingered on the deed. He didn't take it down. Not yet. But he was done, waiting for permission. The house, his family, his name, they were all his to protect. And as he turned off the light and made his way into the darkness of the hallway, the house felt less like a prison and more like a battlefield. A new war had begun, and Henry Caldwell had no intention of losing. Henry's key turned quietly in the lock as he stepped into the familiar coolness of the house. The door creaked slightly as it closed behind him, and for a moment he just stood there, listening to the silence. It was strange, this quiet that felt so heavy, so different from the chaos that had filled these walls in the past. No footsteps, no laughter, no arguments, just the stillness, the kind of silence that comes after a storm, where the echoes of everything that's been said and done are still lingering in the air, but there's nothing left to say. His eyes flicked over the hallway, taking in the photos on the walls, photos of a life he had once cherished. Dust had settled on the frames, a subtle reminder of time's passage. He didn't mind the dust. It was just part of it, part of the history. But the stillness gnawed at him, at the edges of his mind. It was a silence that now lived here, in every room, between every creak of the floorboards. A silence that screamed of betrayal and abandonment, of a family broken. Henry walked slowly through the house, his footsteps heavy on the old wood floors. Every sound seemed to echo louder than it should, as if the house was listening, waiting. He passed the living room, where the old chair he used to sit in remained, its cushions flattened from years of use. He had spent hours there, reading the newspaper or just staring out the window, waiting for Brian to come home, waiting for him to need him. But not anymore. That waiting, that hope, had been shattered, replaced by something much colder. His gaze landed on the shelf in the hallway, where the deed to the house rested under a layer of dust. He walked over to it, his fingers brushing lightly over the paper, the familiar weight of it still there. He hadn't thought about it much since the dinner, since Brian's cruel words had cut through him like a knife. But now, standing here, he couldn't ignore it any longer. It was still under his name. His. Henry took the deed from the shelf, his eyes scanning it briefly, but his mind already elsewhere. His fingers trembled slightly, and he inhaled deeply, forcing the calm to settle into his bones. His late wife's handwriting caught his eye, a note tucked inside the folder. He pulled it out slowly, feeling the weight of her words more sharply now than he had in years. Don't let anyone take what we built. The words were simple, but they were everything. She had written them to him years ago, when they had first moved into this house together, back when everything had seemed so clear, so certain. They had worked so hard to create something of their own, to build a life together. And now it felt as if all of that was slipping away, erased by betrayal, by Brian's cold ambition, by the lies that had been told. Henry's hands clenched around the note. "Not today," he murmured to the empty house. The words were barely a whisper, but they carried with them a conviction he hadn't felt in a long time. He wasn't going to let Brian or anyone else take what they had built, not without a fight. The weight of the decision settled in his chest, as heavy and real as the house itself. It was time to act. He walked to his bedroom, pulling open the drawers and packing only the essentials, a few changes of clothes, his personal papers, the things that really mattered. As he zipped up the duffel bag, his mind raced, piecing together the steps that would come next. He looked around one last time, his eyes moving slowly across the room. The bed, now empty, the photographs of a life once shared, the dresser that still smelled faintly of his wife's perfume. Every inch of this room had been built on memories, on love. And now it was all just memories. Henry stood there for a long moment, his eyes tracing the edges of the walls, the floors he had walked on for decades. He had never imagined it would end like this, alone, with nothing but a duffel bag and a plan. But this was the reality now. The house was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a tomb of everything he had lost. He took one last glance around before turning the lights off. He locked the door behind him, the click of the lock echoing in the silence. The air outside was cold, biting at his skin as he stepped onto the porch, the familiar view of his yard stretching out before him. The house was quiet now, utterly, profoundly silent. Henry paused, his breath visible in the cold air, and he whispered once more, this time with more finality. "Rot here, not today." He walked down the steps, his mind already set on the road ahead. There was no going back. Whatever came next, whatever steps he needed to take, he was ready. His son had drawn the line, and now Henry was crossing it. As he reached the car, Henry couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a fight that would change everything. For the first time in years, he felt the fire of determination burn in his chest. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. He slid into the driver's seat, and as the engine roared to life, the house behind him seemed smaller, less significant. The future was ahead, and Henry Caldwell wasn't about to leave it to chance. The road was long, but it was his to walk now. The drive to Mr. Alston's office was longer than it should have been, but Henry didn't mind. He welcomed the extra time. The long stretch of road between his cabin and the attorney's office gave him the space to think, to let everything settle. The stillness of the morning felt right, the world still quiet and unsure, just like him, though he knew that today would change things. For better or for worse, he had reached a decision, one that had been forming for days. The quiet determination in him was building into something he couldn't ignore anymore. The car's tires hummed on the asphalt, the engine a steady rhythm as the city skyline started to come into view. As Henry drove, he thought about the last few days, the anger, the hurt, the betrayal that had come so easily from Brian, so easily from his son, the man he had given everything to. He had tried for years to be a good father, to offer advice, support, encouragement, but none of it had mattered, not in the end. Brian had made his decision, and now Henry had to make his. His grip tightened on the steering wheel as he turned the corner, the office building coming into sight. Mr. Alston's law firm was in a towering glass building in the heart of downtown Denver, a place that always felt foreign to Henry. The polished marble floors, the glass and steel walls, everything screamed success, everything screamed that the world was moving on without him. But that didn't matter today. Today he was here to claim what was his. He parked the car and sat for a moment, staring at the building. The air inside the car felt colder now, the weight of what he was about to do pressing down on him. He had thought about this moment too many times, let the regret and the anger stew long enough. Now it was time to take action. When he stepped into the office, the cool, sterile scent of paper and leather hit him immediately. He was led through the lobby, and the usual polite receptionist nodded at him without much more than a glance. It had always been this way. Henry had never felt like he truly belonged here, never felt like he belonged in the world of wealth and power. But now, it didn't matter. Mr. Alston greeted him with a firm handshake, his usual composed demeanor not betraying the seriousness of the moment. They exchanged pleasantries for a few minutes. But Henry's mind was elsewhere. He was already thinking about what was next. "Please sit," Mr. Alston said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Henry did, the leather creaking slightly as he settled into it, setting the envelope containing the deed and estate papers down between them. Henry looked at Mr. Alston, steady, controlled. "I'm ready to make changes," he said quietly, his voice firm but not harsh. He didn't need to explain. The moment he walked in, Alston would understand. Mr. Alston's brow furrowed just slightly, and he leaned forward, inspecting the envelope. "You've thought this through?" he asked, the question measured, cautious. He knew Henry well enough to know this wasn't a decision made lightly. Henry nodded, his fingers brushing the edge of the envelope. "I've thought about it for days, maybe longer. I want to rewrite everything under a new trust." The lawyer sat back, studying Henry's face. "Under a new trust?" he repeated, almost as if testing the words, feeling the weight of the change that was being asked. "This is a serious move, Henry. You know what this will mean." "I know," Henry said, his voice steady, "but my son buried me while I was alive. He didn't just take from me. He stripped me of my dignity, my place in this family." The words came out cold, a slow exhale of anger that had been brewing for weeks. He had tried to ignore it, tried to brush it off, but the memory of Brian's words, "Your human waste, rot here," still stung in his chest like a fresh wound. Mr. Alston's gaze softened. He had known Henry for years, watched him endure a quiet suffering, always taking the high road, always putting others first. But now, he could see the resolve in Henry's eyes. This was no longer a man seeking peace. This was a man fighting for his own dignity, his own future. "Then let's resurrect you properly," Mr. Alston said, his voice low, but with an unmistakable respect in it. There was no hesitation, no judgment, only a quiet acknowledgement that Henry had come to the right decision. Henry sat still for a moment, the weight of those words sinking in. Resurrect you properly. It was what he needed to hear. He wasn't dead yet. He wasn't irrelevant. He had spent years building something real, something worth holding on to. And now, he was going to take back what was his. "I want to make sure Brian doesn't touch the legacy anymore," Henry said, his voice hardening. "I want my name, my house, my business, everything protected. I want it under my terms." "Not his. He doesn't deserve it." Mr. Alston nodded, his eyes sharp as he reached for the papers. "It'll take time, but I'll make sure it's done correctly. We'll make sure no one can touch it. Not Brian, not Kara, no one." Henry didn't smile. He didn't need to. He knew the battle was far from over, but the path ahead was clear now. The deed was in motion, the trust was being reworked, and there was no going back. As Mr. Alston began making notes, Henry stood, the weight of the decision still heavy on his shoulders but now steady in his chest. He had made the choice. The rest would follow. Leaving the office, Henry felt something shift. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was something that had been lost, something he was now taking back. And as the door closed behind him, the reality of what was coming settled in. This was just the beginning. Brian and Kara pulled up to Henry's house the next morning, the early sunlight casting long shadows on the front lawn. The place looked unchanged from the outside, quiet, still, almost peaceful in its suburban setting. But Brian could feel the tension in the air, the weight of it hanging over them as they stepped out of the car. He didn't know what he was expecting, but it wasn't this. "Let's just get this over with," Brian muttered under his breath, already annoyed by the turn of events. They had come here to find answers, to reclaim what they believed was theirs, but deep down, a growing unease gnawed at him. Something wasn't right. Kara didn't seem bothered, walking confidently toward the front door, heels clicking sharply on the concrete. "You know he'll come crawling back," she said dismissively. her voice cool as always. He can't just vanish. The old man doesn't have the guts to walk away for good. Brian didn't answer at first. He had heard Kara say similar things before, dismissing his father as if he were nothing. But this time, something about the words hit differently. His father had been cruel, distant. He deserved what he'd gotten, didn't he? Yet, as they stepped inside, Brian couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was happening here, something he didn't fully understand. The front door creaked as Brian opened it, the scent of dust and neglect wafting through the air. The house was empty. The usual clutter, the warm mess of a lived-in space, was gone. No photos hanging on the walls, no signs of life. Just the cold, hollow echo of an empty house. He stepped further in, the floor creaking beneath his feet as he looked around. The living room was bare, empty chairs, bare shelves, the space stripped of its life. No sign of Henry, no sign of anything that would say this place was once a home. Brian's heart skipped a beat, a strange feeling crawling up his spine. It was as though his father had simply vanished. Kara walked past him, unfazed, and her eyes quickly scanned the room. "Well, this is perfect," she sneered. "Just like him. Run off with his tail between his legs. He's probably hiding somewhere, waiting for you to beg him for mercy." Brian wasn't so sure. His gaze fell on the kitchen counter, where a single piece of paper sat, placed deliberately in the center. It stood out, stark against the otherwise empty surface. Brian stepped forward, lifting it carefully, his fingers brushing the edge of the note. It was Henry's handwriting, neat, purposeful. Deeds matter more than words. The words hit him like a cold punch to the gut. Brian's stomach turned as he read them again, then again. The simple message left no room for misunderstanding. His father had made his choice, and it wasn't one Brian was prepared for. "What the hell is this?" Brian muttered to himself, his voice tinged with frustration. He turned toward Kara, but she was already rolling her eyes, unimpressed. "Please," she scoffed. "He's probably off on some guilt trip. He'll come crawling back." Her voice was dripping with dismissiveness, the words cutting through the silence in the house. "Just like he always does." Brian wanted to believe her. He wanted to think that his father, stubborn as he was, would eventually give in, realize his mistake, and come back. But something was nagging at him. Something was off. The emptiness of the house, the finality of the note. The thought of his father truly leaving for good twisted something in his chest. Brian picked up his phone, dialing Mr. Alston's office. He needed answers, needed to know if his father had made any official changes. The phone rang once, twice, before the lawyer's voice answered. "Mr. Caldwell," Alston said, his tone professional but tight. "I'm afraid I can't share that information with you." Brian's patience snapped. "What do you mean you can't share it?" His voice rose, louder than he intended. "You're supposed to be handling my father's estate. We need to know what's going on." There was a long pause on the other end. "I'm sorry, but I cannot divulge any details without Henry's authorization." Brian slammed the phone down, his frustration boiling over. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. He felt helpless. He couldn't even get answers from the people who were supposed to be helping him. This was supposed to be his inheritance, his future. How had it all slipped out of his hands so easily? Kara was watching him, arms crossed, a smirk playing on her lips. "Well, we'll find out anyway," she said with a shrug, her voice confident, almost dismissive of the obstacles. "If your father's hiding something, we'll figure it out." Brian didn't respond. He knew Kara well enough to know that she wouldn't let this go. She would dig, she would push, and she would get whatever information they needed. But deep down, Brian knew that whatever had happened here, whatever Henry had done, it wasn't just about money. It wasn't just about the house. His father had done something more, something that couldn't be undone. And that's when Brian realized the deed, the house, the legacy. It was all slipping through his fingers. Whatever game his father was playing, it wasn't one Brian could win anymore. Kara turned toward the door, already plotting their next move. But as Brian stood there in the silence of the empty house, he felt something more than anger creeping in, a deep, gnawing regret. Something had shifted, something he couldn't put back together. The deed and Henry were gone, and Brian didn't know if he could ever get them back. The drive to the cabin took longer than Henry expected, the winding mountain roads coated in early snow, the tires crunching against the hard-packed earth with each turn. As he made the final bend, the small cabin came into view, a modest, secluded building that had once belonged to his late friend, a place Henry had always admired for its simplicity, its quiet. It was far from the world he had left behind, far from the house that now seemed like a distant memory. Henry parked the car and sat there for a moment, letting the cold silence of the mountains settle over him. The wind blew softly through the trees, and the only other sound was the distant call of a bird. It was everything he had needed, the space, the solitude. No distractions, no Brian, no Kara, just the sharp, still air and the crunch of snow beneath his boots. The cabin was small, 2 rooms at most, with a fireplace that seemed to have been forgotten by time. Henry had no intention of staying in the main house for long. This wasn't a vacation. This was where he needed to be, far away from everything, where he could think, rebuild, and prepare. He needed to make sense of the chaos Brian had left behind. And more than that, he needed to figure out the next move. He wasn't done, not by a long shot. The first few days passed quietly. Henry spent his mornings repairing leaks in the roof and chopping wood. The physical labor felt grounding, purposeful. He didn't need to think about anything else, just the sound of the axe splitting the logs, the feeling of the cold, wet wood in his hands. The work was hard, but it was honest. It was the kind of labor he had known for years. The kind that didn't ask for anything in return, but time. Time he could use to think, to decide what came next. When the work was done for the day, he would sit by the fire, the crackle of the flames filling the room, and let the quiet consume him. There was a peace in that silence, a kind of calm that he hadn't known in years. It was the kind of peace that comes when you let go of what's broken, when you stop fighting the things you can't change. It wasn't long before his phone rang, Sophie's name lighting up the screen. He let it ring once, twice, before finally answering. "Dad," she said, her voice soft with concern. "Are you okay? You've been gone for days. You know you don't have to do this alone." Henry leaned against the windowsill, looking out at the snow-covered trees. "Don't worry about me, Sophie. I'm fine. I'm coming up this weekend," she said. "I want to make sure you're doing okay." "You don't have to," Henry replied, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew she wouldn't listen. Sophie was like that, persistent, loyal. She wouldn't leave him alone, not after everything that had happened. The call ended with promises of seeing each other soon, and Henry went back to his work. But he wasn't really thinking about the tasks at hand anymore. He was thinking about what Sophie had said, about how she had seen him change, how she had seen the man he used to be buried by the weight of his family's expectations and betrayal. The weekend came, and Sophie arrived early in the morning, bundled in a heavy coat, her face flushed from the cold. Henry met her at the door, and they exchanged a brief hug before she stepped inside, immediately surveying the cabin. "It's quiet," Sophie said, her eyes scanning the small space. "Just the way I like it," Henry answered, a faint smile tugging at his lips. He gestured toward the fireplace. "Sit, I'll make coffee." Sophie took a seat, her eyes still roaming the room. "I don't know, Dad. You're too calm. You're not talking about anything. You're just existing here." She folded her arms, her expression a mixture of worry and something more, disbelief maybe. "It's like you've given up on everything." Henry stood still, the weight of her words landing harder than he'd expected. "Calm men build the best storms," he said finally, his voice steady but quiet. He set the coffee pot down and turned to face her, his gaze direct. "I'm not giving up. I'm preparing." Sophie raised an eyebrow. "Preparing for what?" "For what comes next," Henry replied, his voice carrying a quiet determination. "I need to make sure that when the time comes, I'm ready to fight. I can't do that from a place of chaos." Sophie didn't say anything, just nodded slowly, her eyes searching his face for any sign that he wasn't really as calm as he appeared. But she didn't push. She never did. She trusted him, even when she didn't understand him. The two of them spent the rest of the day sorting through old documents, papers that had been gathering dust for years. There were deeds, contracts, old photographs, memories of a life that Henry had nearly lost. As they worked, Sophie asked about everything, about the house, about the trust, about the plans Henry had been making, but he kept most of it to himself. He wasn't ready to show her the full picture, not yet. The evening fell into silence again, the weight of the day settling into the stillness of the cabin. Henry stared into the fire, his mind already turning over the next steps. The work wasn't done. The plan wasn't finished, but it was getting closer. And in that quiet, in the soft glow of the firelight, Henry knew that the storm was coming. He could feel it in his bones. But for now, he had to wait. He had to prepare. The fight was far from over, and he wasn't going to lose it, no matter how long it took. Henry sat in his cabin, the fire crackling softly, but his mind was far from the warmth. The days since he'd arrived had blurred together in a quiet rhythm. Work, reflection, and occasional calls from Sophie. She'd been worried, and he knew it. He had never been good at hiding his emotions, and this time, the weight of his son's betrayal was hanging over him like a storm cloud, dark and relentless. The phone buzzed on the table beside him, a simple message from Sophie. "We need to talk. Call me." He hesitated for a moment, then picked up the phone, dialing her number. The connection rang 3 times before she picked up. "Dad, I need to tell you something." Sophie's voice came through, tight with worry. He could hear the stress in her tone. "I found out about the loan." Henry's pulse quickened. The loan? Brian's latest scheme? He leaned forward, gripping the phone a little too tightly. "What about it?" "Brian took a business loan," she continued, her words coming fast now, a mix of frustration and disbelief. "He took it out under Caldwell Properties, the same name as your trust. I don't know how, but it's tied to everything you built. Everything we've worked for." Henry's chest tightened as he processed her words. His mind immediately flashed to the documents in his cabin, to the trust he had set up. Brian had crossed a line. He was using the family name, Henry's name, without permission, without regard for what it represented. Henry set the phone down briefly, taking a slow breath. He had suspected that Brian would go to any length to manipulate things in his favor, but this was a new level of betrayal. He wasn't surprised, not really, but it still hit him hard. The anger he had been burying for so long began to stir again, a quiet fury that threatened to rise. "I'm not surprised," Henry said after a long pause. He could feel the weight of it, the crushing reality of everything Brian had been willing to risk. His son had tied his success, his future, to Henry's name, to the very foundation of everything Henry had worked for. He had used the family legacy like a safety net, without a second thought. He ran a hand through his hair, his mind moving rapidly. "He's tied his rope to my anchor," Henry muttered, more to himself than to Sophie. "He's used everything I built to prop himself up." Sophie was silent for a moment. She knew her father's anger well. She had seen it before, but this was something else. The disappointment was raw in his voice, and she could feel it. She could feel the sting of betrayal deep in her own chest, too. "Do you know what that means?" she asked quietly. "What he's done?" Henry leaned back in his chair, staring into the fire, the flickering flames casting shadows on his face. "Yes, it means he's signed his own death warrant. But this is something I'll let him do on his own." He paused, letting the finality of his words hang in the air. "Alston confirmed it, didn't he?" Sophie's voice was tight as she responded, "Yes, Dad. Alston confirmed everything. It's legally damaging to Brian, but I don't think he knows yet how deep he's in." Henry sighed, a deep, weary breath that seemed to carry all the weight of years of disappointment. The pieces were falling into place now, one by one. He had spent so much time avoiding the confrontation, trying to salvage whatever he could, but it was clear that Brian wasn't interested in any kind of reconciliation. He was interested in control, in his own success, no matter the cost. "Don't intervene yet," Henry said, the words coming slowly but with a quiet certainty. "Let him sink himself. He thinks he can manipulate his way through everything, but he's playing with fire now. This is his mess to clean up." Sophie didn't argue. She knew her father well enough to understand that once Henry made up his mind, there was no changing it. but she also knew the toll it was taking on him. The anger, the grief, it was all building, but Henry was playing a long game now. He wasn't going to let his son drag him into another mess. Not this time. "I'll be there this weekend," Sophie said, her voice softer now, trying to offer some comfort. "We'll figure this out." Henry nodded, though she couldn't see it. "We will. But this has to be done on my terms, Sophie. He needs to understand what he's done. He's not getting away with this." The call ended with a quiet click, and Henry sat there for a moment, the fire crackling in the silence. He could feel the weight of the decision, the weight of the path he was walking. But it was clear now. His son had crossed a line, and Henry wasn't going to let him erase everything they had built together. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, a cold reminder of the coming storm. But Henry didn't flinch. He had been through worse, and this time it was Brian's turn to face the consequences. The pieces were in motion, but Henry wasn't done yet. The game was just beginning, and his son had no idea what was coming next. Brian sat at the dinner table, the weight of his words hanging heavily in the air. He leaned back in his chair, casual, almost too comfortable for someone in his position. Kara's parents were there, their attention fixed on him, eyes bright with curiosity. This was the moment, the big pitch, the time to pull everything together. "I'm using my dad's place as collateral," Brian said, his voice low but confident, a slight smile playing on his lips. He had rehearsed the line in his head countless times, and now it was spilling out as if it were just another business deal. Kara sat beside him, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of it all, nodding as if this were the most natural thing in the world. Kara's father raised an eyebrow. "Collateral?" he asked, skeptical but intrigued. "You mean the old Caldwell house?" Brian nodded, leaning in slightly, playing the role of the eager, successful businessman. "Yeah, the house is worth a lot, but I can flip it once Dad's out of the picture." He said it casually, as if speaking about a property he had no real attachment to, as though the house didn't hold decades of memories, of hard work and sacrifice. "Once that's done, we'll make a nice profit, and I'll move on to bigger things." Kara smiled, a glint of satisfaction in her eyes. "It's just business, right?" she added, her tone smooth, practiced. "Nothing personal." Brian glanced at her, giving her a tight smile. She was right. It was business. At least, that's what he told himself to justify the lie. After all, his dad had been stubborn, too prideful to recognize that the world had moved on without him. This was his chance to capitalize, to take what was rightfully his. But Henry's house was more than just bricks and beams. It was a symbol, a monument to everything his father had built, everything that had once felt like a solid foundation. But Brian wasn't interested in the legacy. He was interested in the money, the power, the control. "You've got a plan in place for the sale?" Kara's father asked, his tone still cautious, but growing more intrigued. Brian nodded confidently. "Absolutely. We're filing everything, and once the deed's transferred, I can list it." He said it like it was a done deal. "Easy money." Kara leaned forward, a smile still playing at the edges of her mouth. "He won't see it coming," she added, the words more of a warning than an observation. Brian's phone buzzed on the table and he glanced at it, then quickly excused himself. "I'll be right back," he said, rising from the table. He stepped out into the hallway, out of earshot. His fingers tapped nervously against the screen, the message flashing before him from Mr. Alston's office. "They're filing fraudulent claims." Brian froze, the weight of the words sinking in. He knew what this meant. He had been careful, or so he thought. But there it was, the first sign that everything was beginning to unravel. He hadn't anticipated Alston catching the trail so quickly. The paperwork was being reviewed, the details falling apart. He took a deep breath, closing his eyes for a moment. Good. Every lie leaves a paper trail. He had to act quickly. Henry hadn't responded yet, but the legal wheels were already in motion. Brian wasn't about to let the law get in his way. Not now. Not when everything was so close. He shoved the phone back into his pocket, shaking his head as if to dismiss the growing anxiety creeping up his spine. The plan was still on. He'd make sure of it. Returning to the table, he found Kara's parents deep in conversation, clearly satisfied with his explanation. "Everything's in place," he said with forced confidence as he sat back down. "We just need the final signatures, and then it's a done deal." Kara's father nodded, clearly impressed. "Well, you're making all the right moves, Brian. It's a smart play." Brian let out a tight breath. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. The pressure was building, and every step he took felt like walking on glass. That night, after dinner, as Brian and Kara sat on the couch, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Alston's message, the mounting risk, the nagging suspicion that things were slipping through his fingers. His eyes kept drifting to the old family photos hanging on the walls, familiar, forgotten things. Henry's legacy wasn't something Brian could ignore, no matter how hard he tried to block it out. Meanwhile, Henry wasn't letting the betrayal slide. He was already a step ahead. He had filed a quiet legal notice, one that would block any attempts to sell the house. No one had expected it. Certainly not Brian, not Kara. But that was the thing about a game built on lies. Eventually, they caught up with you. Henry, sitting by the fire in his mountain cabin, stared at the deed again. A small smile crossed his lips, and the words felt true now, more than ever. Every lie leaves a paper trail. And Brian, so sure of his plan, had left plenty of tracks. It was only a matter of time before they would come crashing down. The silence in Henry's cabin was deep, but there was movement now, hidden in the stillness. A quiet resolve, a plan forming behind the calm. The next move would be his. But Brian and Kara were already plotting their next steps. They just didn't know yet that their plan had already been blocked. The game was only beginning. The night was colder than Sophie expected when she pulled into the gravel driveway of Henry's mountain cabin. The air was thick with the smell of pine and fresh snow, but it wasn't the chill of the evening that made her hesitate before stepping out of the car. It was the weight of the situation. She had invited Brian and Kara here for dinner, but deep down, she knew it wasn't just a meal. This was a game, a trap. Henry had agreed to it, but only on his terms. He didn't want an argument. He didn't want to fight them face to face. He wanted them to make the first move. And that was exactly what he was about to get. Sophie took a deep breath, steadying herself as she knocked on the door. It creaked open almost immediately, revealing Henry standing there, his face calm, collected, as if this were just another casual evening. The same calmness that had started to unsettle her in the past few weeks. There was a quiet fury in him now, a subtle calculation that Sophie couldn't quite figure out. But she trusted him. She had to. "Come in, both of you." Henry greeted Brian and Kara as they stepped inside, the warmth of the cabin a stark contrast to the cold air outside. Brian entered first, a faint smile tugging at his lips, his eyes scanning the room. Kara followed, her gaze darting across the walls, taking in the rustic charm as if she were in an unfamiliar foreign land. Henry smiled, the gesture kind, but not quite genuine. He gestured toward the dinner table, set simply with white plates, a few candles flickering in the dim light. "Please sit," he said, his voice smooth, warm even, as if none of the betrayal had occurred, as if everything between them was still as it was before. Sophie moved to the kitchen, trying to give them space, but every part of her felt the weight of the charade. She had seen the anger, the hurt, the determination in her father's eyes. She had seen him quietly planning his next move, and tonight, he would make his point. Kara took a seat at the table, her posture perfect, as if she were sitting in a boardroom rather than a humble cabin. She looked at Henry with a knowing smile, but there was something tense beneath her poised exterior. "We thought you'd never forgive us," she said, her voice tinged with both challenge and curiosity. Henry's smile didn't falter, but there was a slight glint of something behind his eyes, something sharp. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms, his gaze meeting hers with quiet understanding. "Forgiveness is easier when you have distance," he said, the words cool, calculated. Kara's smile faded for just a moment, the words hanging between them, heavy. Sophie could feel the unease settle over the table like a thick fog, thickening the air. She glanced at her father, knowing this was the moment, the calm before the storm. Brian, who had been mostly silent, finally spoke, his tone guarded. "We're glad you could put this behind us," he said, his voice low, as if testing the waters. He was trying to read Henry, trying to figure out the angle, but Henry remained unreadable, his posture relaxed, the picture of composure. Dinner began in fits and starts, the clinking of silverware, the quiet murmurs of small talk, but it wasn't the meal that Henry was focused on. He had other plans, and they were about to unfold. After a few more minutes, he reached across the table, slowly pulling an envelope from beneath his plate. He slid it over to Brian, his eyes never leaving his son's face. "Consider it my gift," Henry said, his voice smooth, almost too polite. Brian paused, a flicker of confusion passing over his face. He picked up the envelope, turning it over in his hands. "What's this?" he asked, his brow furrowing, but his curiosity was already piqued. Henry's smile remained, though his eyes were steady. "The sale documents for the old house," he said. "You'll find everything you need inside." Kara's eyes widened, a gleam of greed flashing across her face. Brian opened the envelope, pulling out the neatly stacked papers inside. His hands barely trembled as he flipped through them, his mind already moving, already calculating how he could leverage this new opportunity. But he wasn't looking closely enough. Neither of them were. As Brian scanned the papers, he didn't catch the fine print at first. He was too eager, too ready to claim what he thought was rightfully his. He didn't notice the legal clauses that Henry had slipped in, the clauses that made the sale impossible, that protected the house from being sold under any circumstances. Kara leaned in, her voice low and almost hungry. "This is perfect," she murmured, glancing at Brian with a greedy smile. She had always been the one to take advantage, to pounce on any opportunity. "This is all we need." But Henry's voice, calm as ever, cut through the moment. "You're welcome," he said, his words like ice. "But you should have read the fine print." Brian's eyes narrowed as the realization began to hit him. The papers, the documents, everything had been a setup. Henry wasn't handing over anything. He had just made sure that they were walking right into a trap. The weight of the silence stretched on, the tension at the table thick enough to cut with a knife. Brian's face drained of color as he reread the documents, his fingers trembling slightly now. He looked up at Henry, eyes wide with shock. "You tricked us," Brian said, his voice hoarse, the anger starting to rise in him. Henry's smile didn't falter. "No," he said quietly. "You were too eager to steal." The room was silent, except for the sound of Kara's breath hitching in the quiet. The truth had been laid bare, and Henry had made his move. The dinner was over, but the game was just beginning. The door to the cabin creaked softly as the wind howled outside, a reminder that nothing was certain yet. Not for Brian, not for Kara, and certainly not for Henry. Brian sat across from Henry, the tension between them thick as the papers lay in front of him, neatly aligned and ready for his signature. He had no idea what he was really signing, but he was too eager, too focused on the prize ahead to care. His fingers brushed the pen, ready to make the deal final. It was simple. Sign the papers, and everything Henry had worked for, everything that had tied him to his past, would finally be his. All he had to do was make this one last move. Kara sat beside him, her gaze fixed on the documents, her eyes scanning the fine print, only for a moment before dismissing it. She had long ago learned to trust Brian's judgment. He had done the math. He had figured out the numbers. The house was just a stepping stone, a way to push everything forward. They could flip it, make a quick sale, and then move on to their next big thing. The deed would be theirs, and Brian would finally be free to claim what was rightfully his. "Let's do this," Brian muttered, his voice sharp as he scribbled his name at the bottom of the page. There was no hesitation, no doubt in his mind. This was the end of it, the final step. Kara grinned and quickly moved to grab her phone, dialing a notary friend of hers who could verify the signature online. "I've got this," she said, holding the phone to her ear with the confidence of someone who had spent years playing the game of shortcuts and quick fixes. Henry watched them both, his face calm, unreadable, as though the stakes of this moment were no more significant than a casual business transaction. But he knew, deep down, this was everything. This was his quiet retaliation, his way of reclaiming control, of making sure they could never take what was his, not without paying the price. Brian finished signing. not once glancing up at his father, and handed the document over to Kara. She took it with a smile, pleased with how smooth everything had gone, and proceeded to verify it with the notary. The voice on the phone reassured her, confirming that everything was legitimate, that everything was falling into place. "What a deal," Kara murmured, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "Now we can move forward. Everything's finally ours." Henry didn't flinch. He simply waited, letting the moment stretch on. The silence building like the slow pull of a tide. He had made them believe they were getting what they wanted, made them think they had outsmarted him, that they had successfully weaseled everything away. But in that moment, as he watched Brian lean back, proud of his victory, Henry knew they were wrong. Finally, Henry stood up slowly, his movements deliberate, and he looked directly at Brian. There was no anger in his voice, no loud accusations, just calm, firm finality. "You just sold me your company," Henry said quietly. Brian blinked, not fully processing the words. His confidence wavered for just a split second, but it was enough. "What?" he asked, his voice thin, the doubt creeping in now. Henry nodded, his gaze steady. "Your company, Caldwell Properties. It's mine now. You signed it away." The words hit Brian like a punch to the gut. He stared at the papers in front of him, as though they had somehow changed form, the reality of what he had just done sinking in. Kara's face drained of color as she looked between the papers and Henry. The blood drained from her face as the truth started to unravel in front of them. She looked at Brian, her hand shaking slightly as she spoke. "You tricked us," she said, her voice cracking with disbelief, the realization that they had been played too sharp for comfort. Henry's lips twitched into a small, knowing smile, but there was no joy in it, only quiet, unyielding certainty. "No," he said, his voice calm. "You were too eager to steal. You wanted to take what wasn't yours, and you didn't bother to check what was in front of you." Brian's eyes widened as he picked up the papers again, scanning them now with frantic urgency, trying to find the escape route he had missed before. But there was no escape. The damage was done. Kara turned on him, frustration building as she raised her voice. "This isn't over. We'll find a way around this." But the doubt in her voice betrayed her, the last vestige of confidence slipping away. Henry didn't respond. There was no need. He had already won, and the look in his eyes said everything that needed to be said. Without a word, he turned and walked toward the door, the sound of his boots on the floor, a steady beat in the silence that followed. "Where are you going?" Brian called after him, but Henry didn't answer. He just kept walking, one foot in front of the other, like he was leaving behind something that no longer mattered. The door opened, and with one last look back at the two of them, still sitting there, stunned and angry, Henry stepped outside into the cool air, closing the door softly behind him. He didn't need to say anything more. The storm was coming, but it wasn't his to fight anymore. Brian and Kara were left to argue, the weight of their own mistakes crashing down on them with each passing second. And Henry? He was already one step ahead. The question now wasn't whether they'd try to take it all back. The question was whether they'd survive the fallout. The morning was still, the kind of stillness that sat heavy on the world, as if even the wind knew something was coming. Henry sat at the kitchen table, the glow of the morning sun breaking through the window, casting a warm light on the documents scattered before him. They were final now. His ownership of Caldwell Properties was no longer a whisper of a plan, but a reality. The signatures had been signed, the papers filed. Brian's world was slipping from his fingers, and Henry could feel the quiet satisfaction in that. The phone buzzed, a sharp sound in the otherwise quiet room. It was Sophie. "Dad, I've been trying to reach Brian. He's not answering. I think they know." Henry glanced at the phone, the weight of Sophie's concern clear in her text. He put the phone down, feeling the sharp edges of a decision he had made long ago. "Don't worry," he texted back, his fingers moving slowly across the screen. "They'll figure it out soon enough." As he typed, he could almost hear the distant echo of Brian's voice, loud, confident, brimming with arrogance. But now, all of that confidence had been crushed under the weight of Henry's actions. The battle wasn't just about property. It wasn't about the house. It was about the lesson Henry had been forced to teach his son. Outside, a black SUV pulled into the driveway of Brian's office building, its tires skidding slightly on the wet pavement. Inside, Brian was staring at his phone, his hands shaking as he scrolled through email after email. Notifications kept flooding in, legal notices, calls from his bank, and one glaringly obvious detail. His business account had been frozen. He felt the world tilt beneath him as he stared at the screen, reading the message over and over, hoping it was a mistake. But no. The name Caldwell Properties now belonged to Henry. Every account tied to that name, his business, his investments, everything, was now under his father's control. Brian's heart raced as the weight of the situation settled in. He stood abruptly, knocking his chair back with a violent scrape, pacing the room. He dialed his lawyer's number, the ring on the other end sounding louder than it ever had before. But no one picked up. "Damn it!" Brian shouted into the phone, his voice tight, each breath coming faster as he tried to get a grip. How had it come to this? His frustration bubbled to the surface as he turned to Kara, who had been watching him, her face pale with the same realization. "What the hell are we going to do?" she demanded, stepping toward him, her voice rising in panic. "This isn't just a mess anymore, Brian. You've destroyed everything. You ruined us." Her words hit like a slap, but it wasn't her anger that bothered him. It was the truth behind it. He had been too confident, too reckless. He had believed the lies he had told himself, thinking everything was under control. And now, his world was collapsing. "I'm trying, Kara. I'm trying to fix it," he muttered, voice strained. But it felt hollow, like he was speaking words he didn't believe. He turned back to the phone and dialed again, his father's number. But as the phone rang through, Henry's voicemail picked up. "You've reached Henry Caldwell. Leave a message after the beep." Brian's grip tightened on the phone, his face red with frustration, his mind racing. "Answer, damn it," he growled, slamming the phone down onto the desk, the screen shattering from the impact. He leaned back in the chair, feeling the weight of failure press on him, heavy and suffocating. "Maybe we can fix this," Kara said softly, though even she didn't believe it. "We can go to Alston. There has to be a way to get around this." But Brian didn't respond. He wasn't listening. His mind was too far gone, trapped in a web of his own mistakes. Across town, in the quiet of the cabin, Henry was watching the developments unfold in real time, his phone buzzing every few minutes. His lawyer's updates, bank notifications, Alston's regular briefings. Everything was going according to plan. He had played the long game, letting Brian dig his own hole, and now he was watching him fall into it. Henry glanced at the text from Sophie again. "They're falling apart." He typed a quick reply. "That's gravity, not revenge." As he hit send, the weight of those words settled in. This wasn't about vengeance. It wasn't about punishing Brian for his arrogance. This was about balance. Henry had been pushed to the edge for too long, watching his son and Kara use him, dismiss him, disrespect him. But now, it was all shifting. Everything Brian had taken for granted, the name, the legacy, was slipping through his fingers. And Henry wasn't going to stop it. He couldn't. This was the price of betrayal. The phone buzzed again, a message from Alston. "They're filing legal counterclaims. I'm handling it." Henry set the phone down, letting the silence of the cabin settle around him. It was over. Brian was going to have to face the music. But for now, Henry allowed himself a brief moment of peace. The storm was still gathering on the horizon. It wasn't done yet. It started with a headline that hit the local news feed like a punch to the gut. "Father reclaims family. Name after public insult." The words scrolled across Henry's phone screen, bold and sharp, framed by a photo of him standing in front of the old family home. It wasn't a picture he had taken, nor one he had ever planned to make public, but there it was, his face, unguarded, the weight of everything he had worked for now, laid bare for the world to see. He sat quietly at the kitchen table, the sound of the TV flickering in the background, the image of his own face almost too much to bear. The voice of the reporter continued in the background, narrating a tale of a father's quiet victory over a son's betrayal, of a name reclaimed, a legacy salvaged. There was no mention of the pain, no recognition of the years of humiliation, the broken relationship. The world only cared about the clean, polished version of the story, but Henry knew better. The house, once a place of tension and isolation, had taken on a different air now. The light outside had softened, casting long shadows over the front yard where the familiar faces of his neighbors walked past, eyes darting toward the house and then quickly looking away. He could feel their eyes on him, respectful but cautious. The stories had spread, the details of his son's betrayal no longer whispers. People knew, but they didn't speak of it directly. It wasn't the respect Henry had been hoping for, but it was enough. Enough to start rebuilding, to start being seen for something other than the man who had let his son walk all over him. Enough to silence the doubts, the shame he'd carried for so long. Sophie had warned him about the media frenzy, but Henry had no interest in interviews. He wasn't looking for praise, wasn't seeking some grand redemption in the eyes of the public. He had never cared for the spotlight. All he wanted was his peace, the kind that could only come when you took back what was yours, quietly, privately. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts, and he glanced up, the familiar sound of it pulling him from his reverie. He stood slowly, walking to the door. It opened to reveal Elaine Fisher, his longtime neighbor. She held a freshly baked pie in her hands, a warm, comforting gesture. "I thought you might need this," Elaine said with a small smile, her eyes twinkling with understanding. There were no words of pity in her voice, no attempts to diminish what had happened. She had always been there, quietly supportive, a witness to the long years of silence that had filled Henry's life. "Thank you," Henry said quietly, taking the pie from her hands. He hadn't expected it, but there was something about it that felt right, a simple act of kindness that reminded him there was still good in the world, despite everything. Elaine stepped inside, her presence filling the space with a comfort that had always been hers. They sat down at the table, the pie resting between them, the weight of everything unsaid hanging in the air. After a moment, Elaine spoke again, her voice gentle but firm. "You handled it right," she said, her eyes meeting his. There was no judgment, no surprise, just an acknowledgement of the strength it had taken to do what he had done. "I know it wasn't easy, but you did the right thing." Henry leaned back in his chair, the quiet reflection settling in his chest. He wasn't sure if he felt anything. Pride, relief, anger, everything was too raw, too new to make sense of. But one thing was clear. He had made it through. He had survived, and for that, he would never apologize. "He taught me how to survive humiliation," Henry said, his voice steady but tinged with something darker. "Brian didn't leave me any choice. I had to learn how to stand up again, even if it meant losing him." Elaine nodded, understanding the depth of his words, the years of quiet suffering that had led to this moment. She wasn't speaking of his son's betrayal anymore. They both knew what it truly cost Henry, the pride that had been stripped away, the pieces of his life left scattered along the way. "And you taught him what pride costs," Elaine said softly, her voice carrying the weight of a life lived with quiet wisdom. Henry looked at her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Maybe, but that's not the lesson that matters." Elaine's gaze softened, and for the first time, Henry felt something close to peace. The anger, the pain, the feeling of being wronged, they were still there, deep in the quiet corners of his mind. But now there was a sense of closure, a recognition that some things, once lost, can't be reclaimed, but the dignity to walk away, to rebuild, this was his. The small laugh they shared in that moment was like a lifeline, an acknowledgement of all that had been lost and all that was still left. And for the first time, Henry felt like he might finally be free. But even as he sat there, the quiet of the evening wrapping around him like a blanket, the phone on the counter buzzed again, another notification, another reminder that the battle wasn't truly over. He wasn't sure if he was ready for what would come next, but one thing was clear. This story wasn't finished, and no matter what happened, Henry was going to be standing when the dust finally settled. For now, though, he had this moment. He had Elaine, the pie, and the quiet understanding between them, and that, for now, was enough. But as the pie was sliced and the evening stretched on, Henry couldn't shake the feeling that something was still coming, something he wasn't quite ready for. The drive up to Henry's cabin felt like an eternity for Brian. The mountain roads twisted and turned in a way that mirrored the turmoil inside his chest. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white, the familiar weight of regret pressing down on him with each mile. The cabin, once a place that felt distant and foreign, now seemed like the only place that could hold the answers he needed. He didn't know what he expected when he got there, but he knew he had to face his father. It wasn't just about the house anymore or the business. It was about something deeper, something he hadn't understood until everything had come crashing down. The world outside his windshield blurred as he drove, the trees giving way to the snow-covered hills, the isolation of the cabin reflecting the emptiness he felt inside. He had lost everything: the business, his reputation, his family. And worse than all of that, he had lost his father's respect. He could feel the weight of that loss, heavier than anything else. That, more than anything, had shattered him. It had taken him too long to understand that his father had been right all along. He had been blinded by ambition, by arrogance. He had thought he could use the world and everyone in it, but in the end, it was him who had been used. Brian parked in front of the cabin, the tires crunching against the snow, the engine idling for a moment longer than necessary. He sat there, staring at the old wooden structure that had once been the heart of his family. The same house he had planned to flip, to sell, to destroy. Now, it felt like the only place that could save him. He exhaled slowly, finally opening the car door. His boots crunched through the snow as he walked toward the front porch, the familiar smell of pine and earth in the air. The cabin loomed ahead, cold and quiet. The silence in the air mirrored the emptiness in his chest. He reached the front door and knocked. The sound echoed in the stillness. He waited and waited. The door remained closed. Brian's stomach twisted. He had expected Henry to be there, to confront him, to tell him everything he had done wrong. But Henry didn't open the door. Instead, there was only the sound of shifting inside, footsteps faint but clear. His heart pounded louder than the silence, his pulse racing in his ears. He couldn't wait anymore. He had to speak. "Dad," Brian called, his voice strained with desperation, but there was no answer. He stepped back, looking through the screen door. He could see Henry inside, a shadow against the dim light coming from the cabin. Brian swallowed hard. His throat was dry, and the words felt like they were stuck. But he had to say them. He had to say it, or he would never move forward. "I was wrong, Dad. I lost everything." Still, no response. Henry didn't even move. The silence was suffocating. Brian's hands trembled, his breath shallow in the cold air. It was now or never. "I'm sorry for everything," Brian continued, his voice quieter now, the vulnerability seeping in. "For everything I did, for how I treated you, for thinking I could win without you." His voice cracked slightly, the weight of the apology pulling at his chest. Henry's figure remained unmoving, the only sound the faint breeze rustling the trees around them. Brian felt like he might collapse right there, but he couldn't stop. Not yet. "I know what I did," Brian said, the words barely audible now. "You called me waste." He swallowed hard, staring at the screen door, waiting for something, anything. "I know. I deserve that. But I was the real trash, Dad. I was the one who messed everything up." There was a long silence after that. The kind of silence that makes everything you've said hang in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. Brian could see Henry move, his form shifting in the dim light, but still, he didn't open the door. And Brian, he stood there, waiting. It felt like hours passed, the weight of the moment pushing down on him. He had driven here, broken, humbled, and yet he still couldn't tell if his father was ready to hear him. Was this even enough? Could it ever be enough? Finally, Henry's voice came, low and steady, through the screen door. "You called me waste," he said, the words cutting through the quiet. His tone was calm, measured, but there was something beneath it, something that betrayed the years of pain, the years of waiting for his son to finally understand. Brian's heart sank. "I know," he whispered, not sure what else to say. "I'm sorry." The silence stretched on again, almost unbearable this time. But then, just as Brian was about to turn away, the door creaked open halfway. Henry's face, worn but resolute, appeared in the crack. Henry looked at him for a moment, his eyes searching Brian's face, weighing something in the silence. Finally, his voice broke through the quiet. "You're late," he said, his words heavier than they seemed. "But you're here." Brian's chest tightened, and for the first time, he felt a small breath of relief. The door hadn't been fully opened, but this, the simple acknowledgement, was more than he had dared hope for. He stood there, speechless for a moment, just taking in the weight of those words, of the door slowly opening. The future wasn't clear yet. There was still so much that needed to be mended, but this was the first step, and it was a step he hadn't thought he would ever get. But Henry still hadn't fully let him in. Not yet. And Brian, for the first time, understood that his redemption wasn't something he could rush. It would come, if at all, in its own time. And as the door remained half-closed between them, Brian knew the hardest part wasn't done. It was only beginning. The sun was barely peeking over the ridge when Henry pulled up to the work site. The cabin he had been repairing stood in the clearing, its wooden beams exposed, raw, against the cold morning light. It was a labor of love, a place Henry had poured his time into for years, but it had always felt like a solo project, until now. Brian stood in the center of the clearing, a shovel in his hand, his face streaked with sweat and dirt from a long morning's work. Henry had watched him from the edge of the site for a while, his son moving with the slow, deliberate rhythm of someone who had finally learned the value of hard work, of real labor. It had taken a lot for Brian to get here. For months, all Henry had seen was arrogance, a hunger to control and take what wasn't his. Now, he saw something else. Humility. It wasn't enough yet, but it was a start. Henry cleared his throat and walked toward Brian, the crunch of snow beneath his boots sharp in the quiet. Brian stopped, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand, glancing up at his father. There was no smile, no acknowledgement of the tension between them that had existed for so long. But that was fine. It wasn't about words anymore. It was about actions. "Need a hand?" Henry asked, his voice low, steady, but carrying a weight of unspoken challenge. Brian hesitated for a moment, but then nodded, not out of obligation, but because it felt right. "Sure," he said, voice quiet, his tone carrying more humility than Henry had ever heard from him. It was an unspoken admission that he wasn't the man he had been, that he had lost his way, and now he was trying to find it again. Henry didn't offer him a speech, didn't try to teach him a lesson. Instead, he handed Brian a set of tools and gestured toward the work that needed to be done. "No contracts, just work," he said simply. "If you want to earn it, earn it." Brian took the tools, his grip tight around them, the weight of what his father was offering settling heavily on his shoulders. There was no grand offer, no promises of easy work or guarantees, just a chance to prove himself, not to Henry, but to himself. The weight of the past hung heavily in the air, but it was time to put it aside. They worked in silence for hours, moving rocks, hammering nails, securing the structure that had always been a symbol of Henry's hard-earned success. But today, it wasn't just Henry's success, it was both of theirs. For the first time in years, Brian felt the satisfaction of building something real, something tangible. The hard labor, the sweat and effort. It wasn't just breaking his pride, it was healing something deep inside him, something he had almost forgotten how to access. His muscles ached, his back burned from the work, but it felt right. It felt like he was doing something worth doing. For once, the weight on his shoulders wasn't just regret. It was the weight of his effort, his labor, his willingness to change. Henry worked beside him, the quiet man he had always been, his hands rough from years of hard work, his movements efficient, almost methodical. But there was a quiet understanding between them now, no words needed. Henry didn't expect perfection. He expected effort. He expected responsibility. And for the first time, Brian was ready to give it. Later in the day, Sophie arrived at the cabin. She'd been visiting less frequently in the past few weeks, but something about today felt different. Something about the work, the change in Brian, made her want to see it for herself. She pulled up in her car, stepping out into the crisp air. Her eyes found her father and brother immediately, working side by side, their motions synchronized as if the years of distance between them had been erased in a single moment of shared labor. She stood still for a moment, taking in the sight. There was no tension in the air, no coldness between them, just the quiet rhythm of work, the sound of hammers, the distant thrum of life. She felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years: hope. "Maybe the storm's over," she said softly, a smile tugging at the corners of her lips as she stepped closer to them. Henry didn't look up, but his voice, steady and calm, carried the weight of experience. "No storms," he said, his words carrying more than just their literal meaning. "Just weather." Sophie looked at her father, then at Brian. The pieces were falling into place. They weren't out of the woods yet, but they were building something stronger than the past. It wasn't a miracle, and it wouldn't solve everything, but for the first time, Sophie felt like the foundation beneath them wasn't cracked. It was solid. Brian wiped his brow, looking at the two of them, his father, his sister. He had no illusions about what it would take to truly make things right. The work was only just beginning, but for the first time in years, he felt like he had a place in this family again. He was no longer just a son who had failed. He was someone who had the chance to rebuild, not just the cabin, but everything he had lost. He met his father's eyes for a brief moment, a quiet acknowledgement of everything unsaid, everything still uncertain. The past was there, lingering like the chill in the air, but it wasn't as cold as it had been. And for the first time, Brian wasn't sure what the future would hold, but he wasn't running from it anymore. The work continued, and as the sun began to dip behind the mountains, a sense of quiet resolution settled over them. What they were building was more than wood and nails. It was trust. And trust, as Henry knew all too well, was something that could only be earned through effort, not words. The evening stretched on, but the weight on Brian's shoulders had lessened, if only a little. The hardest part wasn't over, but it was a start. And as Henry worked beside him, Brian felt, for the first time in a long while, like he might just be worthy of the chance his father had given him. The old mountain cabin stood as it had for decades, weathered, worn, but still standing. The bones of the house were strong despite the years of neglect, and Henry could see the potential. He had always known it was there, hidden beneath layers of dust and broken beams. The place had once been a sanctuary for him, a place to escape. Now it was the site of something new, something different. Brian stood beside him, a hammer in hand, his eyes scanning the house, the walls that had once seemed so foreign to him, now feeling more familiar with every passing day. They didn't speak much, and that suited both of them. There was no need for words, just the sound of tools working against wood, the steady rhythm of progress, the quiet bond of men who had been through too much to waste time on pretense. Each nail driven into the wood, each board that was placed, felt like a small step toward something greater, something more than what had been, and Henry could see it, could feel it more clearly now. Brian, his son, had started to transform, not just physically, but internally. There was a quiet determination in the way he worked, a shift in his posture. His hands, rough and calloused from the labor, mirrored Henry's own, and for the first time in years, Henry saw the reflection of his younger self in Brian's movements. He wasn't just building the cabin, he was building something within himself, something he had lost. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that spoke volumes, the kind that comes when the weight of the past starts to loosen its grip. Every time Brian swung the hammer, Henry felt a little more of the anger, the bitterness, slip away. Not all at once, but little by little. There was respect growing between them, not from grand speeches, not from apologies, but from the quiet understanding that comes with shared effort. The morning fog began to lift, revealing a clear sky above the mountains. It felt like a new day, a new beginning, though both of them knew that the road ahead was long. There were still so many things left unsaid between them, so much left to heal. But for now, there was just the work, just the rhythm of their labor, and the gradual rebuilding of something that had been shattered. Kara's name surfaced in Henry's mind, but he didn't speak it aloud. The news had come quietly, through Sophie. She had told him about the divorce papers, the finalization of it all, as though Kara had been planning it for some time. Henry hadn't been surprised, not really. He'd known the marriage was fractured long before the papers were signed, but the weight of it still hung in the air, like the heavy scent of wood and dust that clung to the cabin walls. It wasn't something he wanted to discuss, not now, not in this moment. Brian glanced up at Henry, his expression guarded, but there was a quiet vulnerability in his eyes. "I guess you were right about her," he said, his voice rough with the weight of a truth he hadn't wanted to admit. Henry's gaze flicked to his son, then back to the work ahead of them. "I was right about the house too," he said simply. The words weren't said with bitterness or anger, but with a quiet recognition of the things they had both learned the hard way. The house, the marriage, everything had been built on a shaky foundation, and now it was time to rebuild. Brian looked down at the floor for a moment, wiping his hands on his pants, then looking back at Henry. "I didn't know how bad it had gotten," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "I didn't know how much I had ruined until it was all gone." Henry didn't reply. He didn't need to. He understood all too well the feeling of having everything fall apart, only to realize that it was your own hands that had set it in motion. But he wasn't here to dwell on blame. He was here to rebuild, not just the cabin, but the trust that had been broken. The quiet respect that had started to form between them spoke more than any words could. As the day stretched on, the cabin began to take shape, the walls slowly being restored to their former glory. The afternoon sun dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows over the site. Henry stepped back for a moment, wiping his brow, taking in the progress they had made. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever was. But it was real. It was something they had both worked for. Brian stood beside him, his hands still gripping the tools, but now there was something else in his eyes, something Henry hadn't seen in years. Hope. Not for himself, necessarily, but for the future, for the possibility of redemption, of finding something he had lost. There was no fanfare, no moment of grand celebration. But as they both stood there, looking at the house they had rebuilt together, Henry extended his hand. It wasn't just an offer of reconciliation. It was an acknowledgement of the journey they had both taken, of the distance they had both traveled. Brian hesitated for only a moment, then took Henry's hand, shaking it firmly. The grip was strong, unyielding, like the foundation of the house they had just rebuilt together. For the first time in years, there was a sense of peace between them. The kind of peace that didn't come from easy answers, but from hard work, from earned respect. And as they stood there, side by side, Henry knew the road ahead was still uncertain. But for the first time in a long while, it didn't matter. They had both come through the fire, and now they were building something worth holding on to. But even as they shared that quiet moment of understanding, Henry couldn't help but wonder what would come next. Would this fragile peace hold? Or was it just another foundation, waiting to be tested again? The fire crackled softly in the hearth, its glow casting shadows on the worn walls of the cabin. Henry sat at the wooden table, the weight of the moment pressing down on him like a storm gathering in the distance. The room was still, save for the rhythmic sound of the fire, and in his hands he held the deed. The original deed to the property, now framed in a simple, weathered wooden frame. It was almost a symbolic gesture. This was the deed that had caused so much conflict, so much heartache, but now it was here, right in front of him, as if the past were finally within his grasp, and he could make it right, or at least try. Brian stood across from him, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his shoulders hunched with the quiet tension that had been building between them. He wasn't sure what to say, how to approach the situation. There was so much to fix, so much to make up for, and yet everything still felt fragile, like the weight of this moment could shatter them both. Henry's gaze didn't waver as he looked at the deed, his fingers tracing the frame gently, as if the paper inside held not just ownership, but the history of his entire life, the history of his family. "It's not about land," he said quietly, the words coming out more deliberate than he'd intended. "It's about what you stand on." Brian's breath caught in his throat at the weight of his father's words. He knew this was more than just the house. It wasn't just about the physical land, the property that had been torn from him, or the trust that had slipped through his fingers. It was about everything, the decisions, the mistakes, the things he had taken for granted. It was about what he stood on now, and what his father had always stood for. Henry looked up from the deed, meeting Brian's eyes, his voice steady but firm. "I'm signing over a partial transfer," he said, reaching for the pen and the stack of papers on the table. "To both of you, you and Sophie, under the trust." Brian's heart raced as he processed the words. This was it. This was the moment that could either heal them or tear them further apart. Henry wasn't just giving him something back, he was offering him a second chance. A chance that he didn't fully deserve, but one he desperately needed. "You'll earn it through stewardship, not inheritance," Henry continued, signing the document with a calm precision. "This is about responsibility. What you do with this land, what you build with it. Your choices will determine what kind of legacy you leave, not just for you, but for your family." Brian's hands trembled slightly as he watched his father's signature scrawl across the page. The weight of those words sunk in, deeper than any apology or grand gesture. It wasn't about the money. It was never about the money. It was about earning respect, earning trust, earning a place, not just in his father's world, but in his own. Brian nodded slowly, his chest tight. He could feel the emotion building in him, the flood of everything he had lost, and everything he still had the chance to rebuild. It was overwhelming. He looked at the document now, the finality of it, but also the opportunity. "I don't deserve this," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Henry sat back in his chair, his hands folded together, his eyes softening just the slightest bit. "You could have destroyed me," Brian continued, the words almost spilling out in a rush, as if the guilt he'd carried for so long was finally coming to the surface. "You could have wiped me out completely, and I wouldn't have blamed you." There was a long silence between them. The fire flickered, the room seemed to shrink, and for a moment, the world outside didn't exist. Brian waited for Henry's response, unsure of what to expect, uncertain if forgiveness was even possible. Henry exhaled slowly, his voice quieter now, but carrying a weight of its own. "You did that yourself," he said simply, his gaze unwavering. Brian's chest tightened at the truth in his father's words. He knew it. Deep down, he had always known it. His actions, his arrogance, his mistakes, they had led him here. And in some ways, his father was right. Brian had broken it all, not because of anything Henry had done, but because of his own decisions. He had taken the easy path for too long, always assuming that things would fall into place. But life didn't work that way, and now here he was, standing on the edge of something new, something he had to work for. Henry didn't elaborate, didn't try to make it easier. The silence that followed was thick with the weight of that simple truth. Brian looked down at the papers in front of him, the document that represented a future he had to earn. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air felt heavy with everything they hadn't said, with everything still left unsaid between them. But Brian knew one thing for sure. This was his chance to do better, to rebuild, to earn the respect he had taken for granted, to prove that he was capable of something more than the man he had been. Henry stood, pushing his chair back with a faint creak, and placed the deed in front of Brian. It wasn't an offer, it was a challenge. And Brian knew that the true test wasn't in the signing, but in what he would do afterward. "You know what this means," Henry said, his voice low, but carrying a quiet conviction. "I expect you to live up to it." Brian took the pen, his hand steady now. There were no more excuses, no more delays. This was it, the turning point. He signed the document, the ink flowing smoothly onto the page, a symbolic gesture that would follow him for the rest of his life. As he handed the paper back to his father, their eyes met again. And for the first time in years, Brian felt something shift between them, a silent understanding, a bond forged not in words, but in action. But even as he stood there, the weight of the moment still pressing down on him, Brian knew this was just the beginning. There would be more work to do, more battles to fight, and more lessons to learn. but for the first time in a long time, he was ready. Henry watched him closely, his expression unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that gave Brian hope. The past hadn't been kind, but the future was waiting, and this time, Brian was ready to face it head-on. And as they stood there, in that quiet moment, the road ahead stretched out before them. Neither knew exactly where it would lead, but they would face it together, one step at a time. The wind howled through the trees, battering the cabin with the full fury of the storm. The sky had darkened suddenly, and snow poured down in thick sheets, swirling like a living thing. Outside, the world had been swallowed whole by the storm, the snow piling up around the cabin's walls. The power had gone out hours ago, and now the only light came from the dim glow of the fire, crackling weakly in the hearth. The cabin, which had once felt like a safe haven, now seemed more like a cage, isolated and vulnerable. Henry stood in front of the fireplace, his back hunched, his hands shaking slightly as he poked at the dying embers. He had been working nonstop for days, his body aching from the effort of the last few weeks, rebuilding not just the cabin, but the remnants of a life he had once thought were lost. His hands trembled with exhaustion, but he kept working. He couldn't stop, couldn't afford to. There was still too much to do, too much left to repair. The storm outside raged louder, the wind howling like an animal, pushing against the walls. Henry's breath came in short, labored bursts, his body telling him it was time to stop, to rest. But the weight of everything, the years of hurt, the mistakes, the effort to rebuild, kept him on his feet, his resolve firm. Then it happened. The room seemed to tilt, the world spinning with a sudden, dizzying force. Henry's knees buckled beneath him, and for a brief, terrifying moment, he found himself crumpling to the floor, unable to catch his breath. He fell against the edge of the table, his hands weakly gripping the wood for support, but his body refused to obey. His vision blurred, the weight of exhaustion dragging him down like a stone in water. "Dad," Brian's voice cut through the haze of Henry's consciousness, sharp with concern. The sound of Brian's footsteps reached his ears just before he felt strong hands lifting him, supporting him as he tried to steady himself. "I've got you," Brian said, his voice steadier than Henry had expected, but there was a thread of worry in it. Henry blinked, trying to focus, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He hadn't realized how much he had been pushing himself until now. The years, the burdens, the physical toll, it all seemed to hit him at once. He had never been one to show weakness, but in that moment, it became undeniable. Brian, now fully focused on him, guided him to the couch near the fire, his movements deliberate. The shift in their dynamic was undeniable. Just days ago, it would have been Henry carrying Brian. But now, the roles had reversed, and Henry's pride was all but gone. Brian was the one holding him up, the one offering the strength that Henry couldn't find in himself. Once they were seated, Brian knelt down beside him, his hand on Henry's shoulder, checking his father's condition. "You need to rest, Dad. You've been pushing too hard." Henry didn't respond immediately. He was too exhausted, his body too worn. The storm outside seemed to swell in intensity, the wind roaring like a beast, trying to tear apart the walls of the cabin. But Henry's thoughts weren't on the storm. They were on his son. The anger, the distance, the betrayal. Everything had shifted in these past few weeks, and now here they were, sharing a moment of vulnerability that Henry had never imagined. "I owe you more than a company," Brian said, his voice low, thick with a sincerity that felt like a weight lifted between them. It wasn't just the house or the business that Brian was referring to. It was everything. All the years of misunderstandings, the anger, the distance. Brian knew he had failed his father. He knew he had let him down in ways he could never fully atone for. But now, in the quiet of this storm, with the wind howling outside and the firelight flickering softly in the room, it felt like a fragile reconciliation had begun to take root. Henry turned his head slowly, his eyes locking onto Brian's. The fatigue in his gaze was heavy, but there was a depth in his voice when he finally spoke. "Then live like it," he said quietly, his words carrying more weight than Brian had anticipated. It wasn't a command, but a challenge. a challenge to prove himself, not just to his father, but to himself. Brian met his father's gaze, something stirring deep inside him. Determination, maybe, but also a sense of responsibility. The road ahead wasn't easy, and there would be more struggles, more moments of doubt. But in that moment, as the storm raged outside, he made a silent vow to his father. He wouldn't just take what was given to him. He would earn it, earn his place, earn his father's trust. The fire crackled softly, the flames flickering and casting warm shadows on the walls. The storm outside seemed to lose some of its ferocity as the evening stretched on, but the weight of their silence didn't feel uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that spoke of things being rebuilt, not just physical structures, but relationships that had been broken and now had the chance to heal. They sat there together, father and son, side by side. The past was still there, lingering like the storm outside, but the future, what lay ahead of them, felt a little clearer, a little brighter. They didn't have all the answers, didn't know exactly how things would unfold. But they were together, and for the first time in years, that was enough. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside, the fire burned brighter. It wasn't a complete victory, it wasn't resolution, but it was a beginning, a fragile, tentative first step towards something more than just survival. As Henry glanced at Brian, the quiet of the moment wrapped around them both, and for the first time, it felt like they were both moving forward, together. But just as the silence seemed to settle, a flicker of movement in the corner of the room caught Henry's eye. The shadows danced on the walls, and in that flickering light, something else, something unspoken, hung in the air. The road ahead was still long, the storm was still raging, and neither of them could yet say what would happen when it passed. The last of the snow had finally begun to melt, and the mountain air felt fresher, lighter, as if it too were breathing a sigh of relief. The ground, still soft with remnants of winter, had begun to thaw, revealing patches of green poking through the dirt. It was the kind of change that felt as though nature itself had been holding its breath, waiting for the right moment to release what had been trapped for months. Spring had returned, and with it, new life. Henry stood on the edge of the construction site, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his jacket, eyes squinting against the sunlight. The chill still hung in the air, but the warmth of the sun was undeniable, soaking into his bones. It felt like a long time since he had seen this kind of promise, this kind of renewal. The cabin, once abandoned and broken, was now surrounded by the hum of new activity. Workers moved around with purpose, the sounds of hammers, drills, and saws filling the air as they began to breathe new life into the structure. Brian stood at the center of it all, his back straight, his eyes scanning the work. He was no longer the arrogant son who had once seen the land and the family business as things to be conquered. No, now he was leading with a quiet confidence, his hands calloused and rough from the work he had done himself. He moved with authority, but no longer with the need to prove himself. He was here, in this moment, because he had earned it. Henry watched him, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. His son, the one who had nearly destroyed everything, was now the one who was rebuilding it. There was no fanfare, no dramatic speeches, just the steady rhythm of work, of progress. The past hadn't been forgotten, but it was no longer the thing that defined them. Sophie arrived just as the first of the workers began to roll up the blueprints for the next phase of the project. She was holding a clipboard, her brow furrowed in concentration, but her eyes lit up when she saw Henry standing by the site. She walked over, her steps purposeful but easy. The months had brought change, not just in the land and the cabin, but in the family as well. The trust had been divided, the business plans realigned, and now, with the foundation of the cabin and the family steadily being rebuilt, Sophie had taken on the role of managing the finances. She stood beside Henry for a moment, watching as Brian directed the workers, giving orders, making adjustments. "Seems like he's finally found his place," Sophie said, her voice soft but full of meaning. "The name means something now." Henry didn't answer right away. His eyes followed Brian, the way his son moved with purpose. There was still so much to be done, so many walls to be rebuilt, so many gaps to fill, But there was no mistaking it. The transformation was real. It wasn't just about the house. It was about everything. Henry finally turned to Sophie, his gaze steady. "Because it costs something," he said simply, the weight of those words carrying far more than their simplicity suggested. There had been so much loss, so much pain, but it had also given them something they hadn't had before: clarity, understanding, a chance to rebuild. He smiled then, a quiet smile, proud but peaceful. It wasn't the kind of smile that came with grand gestures or celebrations. It was the smile of a man who had weathered storms, both literal and figurative, and had emerged, not unscathed, but stronger for it. Sophie's smile mirrored his, a knowing understanding between them. They had both been through hell. They had both lost things they thought they could never get back. But now, standing there in the warmth of the early spring sun, with the scent of fresh earth and new beginnings filling the air, it felt like they had finally found their way home. Brian walked over to them then, wiping his brow with the back of his hand, his face flushed with the effort of the day. He nodded at his father, a silent acknowledgement of the work they were doing, of the work he had to do to truly earn the future. "You've made a lot of progress," Henry said, his voice steady but filled with quiet pride. Brian glanced down at the plans in his hand, then back at his father. "We've made a lot of progress," he corrected, his voice steady. The "we" wasn't just a word, it was the truth. The family, the business, everything had been rebuilt through effort, through sacrifice, through shared labor. Sophie watched the two of them, standing side by side now, the tension between them from the past, slowly eroding away with each passing day. They weren't there yet. There were still things unsaid, things left to repair, but they had come further than either of them had thought possible. "We all have," she added quietly, her eyes flicking between her father and her brother. It wasn't just the cabin that had been restored. It was the family. Slowly, cautiously, but it was happening. The wind stirred gently, carrying the faintest scent of the mountains in the distance. The storm had passed, the snow had melted, and now the mountains were beginning to bloom again. The trees were budding, the grass turning green, and life was returning to the land. The cabin was no longer a symbol of decay and abandonment. It was a symbol of renewal, of second chances, of things rebuilt from the ground up. Henry stood there, his hands in his pockets, his heart still carrying the scars of everything that had come before. But now, as he looked at his children, as he watched them work, he realized that the hardest storms weren't the ones that tore things apart. They were the ones that tested whether or not you could rebuild after they passed. And for the first time in years, he felt the faintest stirrings of hope. But the road ahead was still uncertain, and as he looked out over the site, the hum of construction a steady reminder of everything that still needed to be done, he knew this peace, this fragile peace, was not yet guaranteed. The sun dipped lower in the sky, and the mountains stood tall, timeless, just as they had always been. But now, as the seasons changed, they too seemed to carry a promise of renewal. The smell of roasting meat and freshly baked bread filled the small cabin, mixing with the earthy scent of pine and wood smoke. It was a humble meal, nothing extravagant, just a simple dinner, but it carried a weight far heavier than any fine dish could ever hold. Henry had invited his children, both of them, to share this meal. For the first time in what felt like forever, the family would sit down together at the same table. The scars of the past were still there, lingering beneath the surface, but for tonight, Henry wanted to believe in the possibility of something more. The kitchen was warm, the small space crowded with the sense of a homecoming. Brian was at the stove, his hands deftly turning the roast, adding herbs, adjusting the heat with the care of someone who had learned the value of doing things with his own hands. His movements were slower now, more measured, a far cry from the brash arrogance he had carried with him before. His face was focused, but there was a soft smile on his lips, a smile that felt real for the first time in a long time. Sophie stood nearby, setting the table with the kind of quiet determination that had defined her over the past few months. She arranged the plates, the glasses, and the silverware with the care of someone who understood that tonight wasn't just about food. It was about more than that, about rebuilding, about showing up for each other in a way they hadn't done in years. The flickering light from the candles on the table cast soft shadows on the walls, the warm glow making everything seem a little softer, a little more forgiving. Outside, the night had settled in, but inside, the room felt alive. For the first time, Henry didn't feel like a man at the end of something, but rather at the beginning of something new. The work was far from over, the wounds still raw, but tonight, the weight of the world felt just a little lighter. As they sat down at the table, Henry couldn't help but notice how much things had changed. The silence that had once been so heavy between them now felt comfortable, like an old friend returning. There were no grand speeches, no false promises, just the sound of silverware clinking against plates and the occasional murmur of approval as they tasted the food Brian had cooked. It was good, simple, honest, the kind of meal that, for a fleeting moment, made everything feel right. Brian set down his fork for a moment, looking at Henry with a gaze that had softened over the months. "You're still the head of this family," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of everything unsaid. There was respect in his words, an acknowledgement of the things Henry had endured, of the way he had kept the family together through all the storms. Henry looked at his son, his eyes steady, but his voice calm. "No," he replied, his words slow but firm. "Just the root." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was full of understanding. Henry didn't want to be the head of the family anymore. He didn't need to be. That was a title that carried too much weight. What mattered now, what truly mattered, was that the foundation was solid, that the roots were strong enough to support whatever came next. Sophie looked up from her plate, her eyes soft, her smile genuine as she raised her glass. "To lessons we didn't want, but needed," she said, her voice carrying across the table. Brian and Henry exchanged a glance, and then, one by one, they all lifted their glasses. The quiet clink of the glasses rang in the room, a simple sound, but one that held meaning. It wasn't just a toast to what they had been through, but to what they were building, to the future that had yet to be written. "Cheers," Brian said, his voice thick with emotion. There was no more bitterness, no more resentment. The past was still there, but they were no longer letting it define them. Home felt alive again. It was a quiet kind of life. Not the kind of vibrant energy you see in movies or hear about in stories, but the kind that comes from small, meaningful moments. The clink of glass, the shared meal, the laughter that didn't feel forced but earned. It wasn't perfect, not by any means. There were still things to fix, words left unspoken, but in that moment, Henry felt something he hadn't felt in years, a peace that came from knowing, deep down, that the family was on the road to healing, together. As the meal stretched on, the conversation flowed more easily than it had in months, even years. They talked about everything and nothing, the weather, the work, the things that had once seemed so important, but now felt so distant. The laughter wasn't forced, it was real. It felt like a renewal, like the thawing of something frozen for too long. But even as they sat there, comfortable in the warmth of their shared space, Henry knew there was still much work ahead. They weren't out of the woods yet. The storm had passed, but the recovery would take time. There were still scars to heal, mistakes to mend. As they finished their meal and the last of the evening sun began to fade from the sky, Henry leaned back in his chair, a small smile on his face. He could feel the weight of the moment, the subtle shift in the air between them. But there was no finality in it, not yet. They had made it this far, and for now, that was enough. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Henry allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they were on the right path. Henry sat at the old wooden desk, the tip of his pen hovering over the journal page. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, casting flickering shadows on the walls, but the room felt still, the quiet weighing heavily on him. His hand trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from the effort of putting words down that he had carried inside him for so long. The journal had always been a place for him to reflect, to make sense of the things he couldn't say out loud. Tonight, it felt like the last page of a chapter he had been writing for years. He exhaled slowly, leaning over the page and finally writing, "He called me waste, but waste can fertilize growth." The words felt like they carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken moments, 1,000 years of regret and resentment that had festered until there was nothing left to do but face it. He remembered Brian's words, the cruel ones that had struck deep, the ones that had almost broken him. Waste. It had been a dismissal, a harsh label meant to crush whatever strength Henry had left. But tonight, it wasn't the hurt that consumed him. It was something else. The pen scratched the page one final time, the ink flowing steady. Henry put the pen down and let his gaze linger on the journal entry, the silence in the room thick with meaning. Waste. It had felt like that at the time, like he had been discarded, like he had been nothing more than an afterthought. But now, with the work done, the family healing, and the land finally in their hands, he saw it differently. His pain, his struggles, everything had led to something more. It had all led to this moment, to a second chance. The firelight flickered in the corner of the room, and Henry's eyes moved to the mantelpiece, where the deed now rested, placed deliberately beside the family photo. The house, everything he had fought for, was no longer just a symbol of what had been taken from him. It was a symbol of what he had rebuilt. It was a symbol of his strength, his resilience. And more than anything, it was a reminder of the legacy he was leaving behind. A legacy that wasn't defined by the failures, but by the lessons learned through them. Henry stood up, the ache in his bones reminding him of how much he had given to get here. But he wasn't bitter anymore. There was no anger left in him. The long road, the pain, the sacrifice, he had walked it, and now, with steady hands, he felt at peace. The only thing left was to let it go. He reached for the deed and, with a final glance at the photo of his family, set it on the mantel next to the photo of a younger, happier time. There was something sacred about the act, placing the deed there, like closing the final chapter of a long, painful book. The morning light was just starting to creep through the curtains, casting pale fingers of dawn across the room. Henry walked toward the door, the weight of the night still in the air, but the weight of the past now lifted from his shoulders. He stepped outside into the crisp air, the chill of the morning biting at his skin, but somehow feeling refreshing, like a new beginning. The sky was tinged with orange and pink, the sun just beginning to rise over the mountains. It was a new day, a day where he could finally breathe. As he walked down the path, the soft crunch of snow beneath his boots was the only sound that accompanied him. The world felt so still, so at peace, that it was hard to believe just how much had changed in the past few months, but it was real. Everything was different now. The old cabin stood proudly in the distance, its walls a little more whole, its structure a little stronger, and behind him, the family was healing. He could feel it. He looked up as he reached the street, where Elaine was standing at the edge of her yard, watching him. She was a quiet presence in his life, the one person who had always understood, always been there without asking for anything in return. She raised her hand in greeting, her smile warm and genuine. "Everything okay now?" she asked, her voice carrying across the space between them. Henry stopped for a moment, letting the question hang in the air. Everything had been broken, had been torn apart. But now, it was as if the pieces were finally coming back together, each moment of rebuilding bringing him closer to something that felt like peace. "Better than okay," he said, his voice steady, his heart full. There was no need for more, no need for explanations. His journey had come full circle. Elaine smiled, and for a moment they stood there in silence, watching the sun climb higher, the sky changing color with the promise of a new day. Henry took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything he had lived through and everything that was still to come. It wasn't a perfect world. It wasn't a perfect family, but it was theirs. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. The camera slowly panned back as they stood together, the quiet morning around them, slowly giving way to the hum of life. The snow had melted. The winds had calmed, and the mountains stood tall in the distance, a symbol of renewal and strength. Henry walked into the warmth of the house, And as the camera lingered on the family photo and the deed on the mantle, it was clear. The legacy was finally his.